The night they laughed at Harrison Reed was the night everything began to fall apart, although none of us realized it yet. The dining room of Harrison Estate had always been designed to impress. The room stretched nearly 40 feet from one end to the other, with tall windows overlooking the dark grounds and a crystal chandelier casting warm light across the polished oak table. Portraits of long-dead family members watched silently from the walls as if they were waiting for another chapter to be added to the family history. That evening, every seat was occupied except one. Harrison sat alone at the far end of the table, separated from the rest of the family by distance that felt much greater than a few yards. At 70 years old, with silver hair that never seemed interested in staying neat and faded denim beneath a worn work jacket, he looked nothing like the powerful people gathered around him. Across the table sat Isabel Harrison. At 48, she carried herself with the effortless confidence of someone who believed the future already belonged to her. Her long blonde hair framed a composed face that rarely revealed genuine emotion. She poured wine into David's glass before he even realized it was empty. David accepted it with a tired smile. Lately, he looked exhausted, as if the weight of the family legacy had settled onto his shoulders and refused to leave. Ethan noticed it too. The 24-year-old grandson remained unusually quiet, watching everyone instead of participating. His eyes moved from Isabel to David, then briefly toward Harrison. He seemed to be searching for something he couldn't quite name. Near the fireplace, James the family butler stood ready to assist, though his attention occasionally drifted toward Harrison. Eleanor sat beneath the chandelier, carefully avoiding eye contact with anyone. She stirred her tea slowly and spoke only when spoken to. To an outsider, it might have looked like an ordinary family dinner inside an old money estate, but there was tension hidden beneath every polite smile. "The trust meeting is next month," Isabel said casually while setting down the wine bottle. "We should start discussing future leadership decisions." The room became noticeably quieter. David lowered his gaze. Eleanor tightened her grip on her cup. Even James paused for half a second. Only Harrison remained unchanged. He continued eating without looking up. Isabel smiled politely. Of course, everyone's opinion matters. The statement sounded generous. Somehow it felt like a warning. Ethan glanced toward Harrison again. The old man finally raised his eyes and met Ethan's stare for a brief moment. There was no frustration there, no defeat, no anger. Instead, Ethan saw something that unsettled him far more. Patience. The kind of patience that takes years to build. The kind that waits for exactly the right moment. Then Harrison returned to his meal as though nothing had happened. And for the first time that night, Ethan began to wonder whether the person everyone dismissed at the end of the table might actually be the most dangerous person in the room. The following morning, Harrison Estate looked as flawless as it always had. Sunlight spilled through the tall windows, illuminating polished floors and carefully arranged antiques that had remained in the family for generations. From the outside, nothing appeared unusual. Inside, however, small cracks were beginning to show. Isabel moved through the house with the confidence of someone who believed every room belonged to her. Staff members greeted her before anyone else. Financial reports arrived on her desk before they reached David. Even contractors and advisors often asked for her approval before making decisions. Over the years, nobody had questioned how much influence she had gained. It happened gradually, one decision at a time, one signature at a time, one conversation at a time. David sat in his office reviewing documents, but his attention drifted repeatedly toward the window. The pressure of managing the estate seemed heavier every month. Isabel stepped inside carrying a folder and offered a reassuring smile. "You are working too hard," she said. "Let me handle the meeting schedule." David nodded without argument. It was easier that way. Across the estate, Ethan walked through the library searching for a book Eleanor had mentioned years earlier. Instead, he found something stranger. Several shelves contained old family ledgers dating back decades. Most appeared untouched, yet one section showed signs of recent use. A thin layer of dust covered every nearby shelf except 3 books that looked unusually clean. Ethan pulled one from its place and opened it. Inside were handwritten notes and references to family trusts, property transfers, and meeting dates. None of it made immediate sense. Still, something about it made him uncomfortable. Later that afternoon, Eleanor sat alone in a sunroom overlooking the gardens. Her tea had gone cold long before she noticed. She watched workers trimming hedges and maintaining pathways while memories drifted through her mind. There were things she had kept quiet for years, promises she had made, decisions she regretted. When James entered carrying fresh tea, neither spoke for several seconds. Finally, he said, "Some secrets do not stay buried forever." Eleanor looked up slowly. "I know." Meanwhile, at the far edge of the property, Harrison stood inside an old maintenance building rarely visited by anyone else. A worn notebook rested open on a wooden workbench. He carefully added another date, another observation, another detail. The notebook was already thick with years of entries. Outside, the wind rattled the trees. Inside, Harrison closed the cover and stared at a single name written across the top of the most recent page. Isabel. Ethan could not stop thinking about the ledger he had found in the library. For the next several days, the discovery stayed in the back of his mind while life at Harrison Estate continued as if nothing had changed. Breakfasts were served on schedule. Meetings came and went. Guests arrived through the front gates and left impressed by the estate's timeless elegance. Yet the more Ethan paid attention, the more he noticed things that previously seemed insignificant. Isabel always knew about decisions before anyone else. She often answered questions directed at David. When financial advisors visited, their eyes naturally drifted toward her before speaking. Even David appeared to rely on her judgment more than his own. One afternoon, Ethan found himself in the estate office reviewing old photographs for a family project. While sorting through boxes, he noticed something unusual. Several photographs that should have been stored together were missing. The dates on the folders suggested entire years had been partially removed from the archive. Curious, he asked James if he knew anything about it. The butler paused for a moment before answering. Old families sometimes decide which memories deserve preserving. The response sounded polite, but it did not answer the question. Later that evening, Ethan passed through a hallway near the West Wing and overheard part of a conversation. Isabel stood inside a study speaking quietly on the telephone. He could not hear every word, but one phrase caught his attention. "No changes until after the trust meeting." The sentence lingered in his mind long after she ended the call. At dinner that night, the atmosphere felt strangely formal. Thomas Whitmore had joined the family. The elderly attorney spoke little, but Ethan noticed him exchanging brief glances with Eleanor several times throughout the meal. Neither appeared comfortable. Across the table, Harrison remained silent as usual. He listened more than he spoke. As the conversation shifted toward future investments, Isabel confidently outlined several proposals. Everyone seemed prepared to agree. Everyone except Harrison. He set down his fork and looked directly at Thomas. "Have all the documents been reviewed?" he asked calmly. The question was simple, yet an uncomfortable silence followed. Thomas adjusted his glasses before answering. "Not all of them." Isabel's smile faded for only a second before returning. Most people would have missed it. Ethan did not. For the first time, he realized that beneath the polished manners and carefully managed appearances, people inside this house were hiding far more than family disagreements. And somewhere behind those hidden truths, a much larger story was waiting to be uncovered. The following week, Ethan found a reason to spend more time in the West Wing of the estate. Officially, he was helping organize family records ahead of the upcoming trust meeting. Unofficially, he was looking for answers. The missing photographs, the strange ledger, and Thomas Whitmore's uneasy response at dinner had formed a puzzle he could no longer ignore. One rainy afternoon, he entered an old study that had not been used regularly in years. Dust covered most of the furniture, but one desk appeared noticeably cleaner than everything around it. The drawers were locked. That alone was unusual. Harrison Estate contained hundreds of documents, and very few were kept under lock and key. Ethan was examining the desk when he heard footsteps approaching. He turned to find Eleanor standing in the doorway. For a moment, neither spoke. Then she looked at the desk and sighed. "Some rooms are closed for a reason," she said quietly. Ethan expected her to leave. Instead, she walked to the window and stared out at the rain. When people believe they are protecting a family, they sometimes keep secrets too long. The words seemed directed more at herself than at him. Before Ethan could ask another question, she left the room. That evening, he could not stop thinking about what she had said. Meanwhile, Isabel appeared more confident than ever. Preparations for the trust meeting were accelerating. Advisors arrived almost daily. New reports circulated through the estate office. David spent long hours reviewing projections and financial summaries, though Ethan noticed that most of the documents seemed to pass through Isabel's hands first. She always had explanations. She always had recommendations, and everyone seemed willing to accept them. Everyone except Harrison. Later that night, Ethan passed by the old maintenance building near the edge of the property. A light glowed through the window. Curious, he approached quietly. Through the glass, he saw Harrison seated alone at a workbench. The old notebook lay open in front of him. Beside it sat several folders, carefully organized and labeled with dates stretching back years. Harrison studied them one by one with the patience of someone finishing a project that had taken far longer than anyone realized. Then he removed a sealed envelope from a drawer and placed it on top of the stack. Across the front, written in neat handwriting, were 4 simple words: "Open at trust meeting." Ethan stepped back from the window. His pulse quickened. Whatever was hidden inside that envelope had been prepared long before he ever began asking questions. And for the first time, he suspected that the upcoming meeting was not going to unfold the way anyone expected. 2 days before the trust meeting, a new name entered Ethan's life. He was reviewing old estate correspondence in the library when he found a reference that appeared repeatedly across financial records from the past 7 years. Lily Carter. The name appeared beside consulting contracts, property reviews, and several transactions that seemed far too important for someone nobody in the family ever mentioned. Curious, Ethan searched deeper through archived files. The more he looked, the more often her name appeared. Yet there were no photographs, no biographies, and no clear explanation of her role. That absence felt deliberate. Later that afternoon, Ethan drove into town and stopped at a small records office. After several hours of searching public documents, he finally found something unusual. Lily Carter was connected to a private holding company that owned portions of several properties neighboring Harrison Estate. Even stranger, the company had been established shortly after Isabel gained significant influence over family operations. Ethan stared at the dates. It could have been a coincidence, yet it did not feel like one. Back at the estate, Isabel seemed entirely at ease. She spent the evening discussing trust preparations with David in the study. Her voice remained calm, her recommendations practical, her confidence unwavering. David listened carefully, often agreeing before she finished speaking. Watching them from across the room, Ethan found himself wondering how many decisions over the years had truly belonged to David. Meanwhile, Thomas Whitmore arrived earlier than expected and requested access to several old trust documents. The request immediately created tension. Ethan noticed it in the way Eleanor suddenly became quiet. He noticed it in the way James paused while serving coffee. Most of all, he noticed it in the brief expression that crossed Isabel's face when Thomas mentioned reviewing historical amendments. It lasted less than a second. Then it disappeared. That night, Ethan walked past the maintenance building again. The light was on. Harrison sat at the workbench surrounded by folders, notes, and records accumulated over many years. Unlike Ethan, he did not appear confused by the pieces of the puzzle. He looked like a man checking final details before a long-planned event. Without looking up, Harrison spoke. "You have been asking questions." Ethan froze. "Yes." Harrison nodded slowly. "Good." The answer surprised him. After a long silence, Harrison slid a single photograph across the table. Ethan picked it up and stared. The image was more than a decade old. Standing beside a much younger Isabel was a woman he had never seen before. On the back of the photograph, written in faded ink, were 3 words that changed everything. "Find Lily Carter." The next morning, Ethan left the estate before sunrise. The photograph remained folded inside his jacket pocket the entire drive. He did not know exactly what he expected to find, but Harrison's reaction the night before had convinced him that Lily Carter was more than a forgotten name buried inside old records. By noon, he was sitting inside a small county archives office reviewing business filings connected to the holding company. At first, everything appeared ordinary. The paperwork was clean. The ownership structure looked professional. Yet one detail kept appearing. Every major change to the company seemed to occur shortly after important financial decisions at Harrison Estate. The timing was too precise to ignore. Hours later, another discovery made him sit upright. A legal consultant had signed several documents on behalf of the company. The consultant's name was Sophia Bennett. Ethan recognized it immediately. Sophia was a respected attorney known for handling complex trust disputes. He copied the information and returned to the estate with more questions than answers. Meanwhile, preparations for the trust meeting continued. Staff moved through the halls carrying files and arranging conference materials. Advisors arrived throughout the afternoon. Isabel appeared completely composed. She greeted guests warmly, reviewed schedules, and discussed future plans with confidence that impressed nearly everyone around her. To most observers, she looked like the natural leader of the family's future. That evening, Ethan found Sophia's professional contact information and requested a private meeting. To his surprise, she agreed almost immediately. They met the following day at a quiet office 20 miles from the estate. Sophia listened carefully as Ethan explained what he had discovered. When he showed her the photograph, her expression changed. She studied it for several seconds before placing it gently on the desk. "I have seen that woman before," she said. Ethan felt his pulse quicken. "Lily Carter?" Sophia nodded. "Years ago. Briefly. She was involved in several transactions connected to family trusts." Ethan leaned forward. "Was she connected to Isabel?" Sophia remained silent for a moment. Then she opened a file drawer and removed a thin folder. "I cannot answer that completely yet," she said. "But I can tell you this. Someone spent years creating layers between certain decisions and the people responsible for them." As Ethan left the office, the weight of her words stayed with him. Back at Harrison Estate, the lights of the grand house glowed against the darkening sky. The trust meeting was now only days away. And somewhere inside those walls, someone already knew the truth was getting dangerously close. The day before the trust meeting, the atmosphere inside Harrison Estate changed. Nobody mentioned it openly, yet everyone seemed to sense that something important was approaching. Conversations became shorter. Doors closed more often. Even the staff moved through the hallways with unusual caution. Ethan spent most of the morning reviewing the information Sophia had provided. Piece by piece, the picture was becoming clearer. Certain transactions had been routed through companies connected to people who rarely appeared in official records. Important decisions had been separated from the names attached to them. Nothing looked illegal on the surface. That was what made it so effective. Whoever designed the structure understood exactly how to hide influence without attracting attention. Meanwhile, David appeared increasingly distracted. During a meeting with financial advisors, he asked several questions that he normally would have ignored. Isabel answered each one calmly, but Ethan noticed a subtle change. For the first time, David did not immediately accept every explanation. The difference was small, yet it was there. Later that afternoon, Thomas Whitmore arrived carrying 2 locked briefcases. He entered the library without speaking to anyone and remained there for hours with stacks of trust documents spread across a long table. Eleanor visited him briefly. When she emerged, her expression looked heavier than before. James watched from a distance, but said nothing. That evening, Ethan found Harrison sitting alone near the fireplace in a rarely used sitting room. The old man appeared relaxed, almost indifferent to the tension surrounding the estate. Ethan sat across from him. "Did you know all of this would happen?" he asked quietly. Harrison studied the fire for several moments before answering. "People reveal themselves when they believe nobody is watching." Ethan thought about the notebook, the photograph, and the sealed envelope. "How long have you been watching?" Harrison's eyes remained fixed on the flames. "Long enough." Before Ethan could ask another question, Harrison stood and walked away. Hours later, after most of the house had gone to sleep, Ethan received a message from Sophia. Attached was a scanned document dated nearly 10 years earlier. His eyes widened as he read the signature at the bottom. It belonged to Lily Carter. Beneath it was a second signature, one that connected everything they had been investigating, one that should never have appeared on the same page. Ethan stared at the screen in disbelief. For the first time, he finally understood why Harrison had spent years preparing for this moment. The trust meeting began at 10 o'clock sharp inside the estate's grand conference room. Morning light filtered through tall windows and settled across polished wood, leather chairs, and generations of family history displayed on the walls. Every major figure connected to Harrison Estate was present. David sat near the center of the table reviewing documents. Isabel appeared calm and composed beside him. Eleanor remained unusually quiet. Thomas Whitmore organized folders with deliberate precision while James served coffee and then stepped silently toward the back of the room. Ethan took his seat and carefully watched everyone. He had barely slept. The document Sophia had sent the night before remained fresh in his mind. Across the room, Harrison entered last. As usual, few people paid much attention to him. The meeting opened with financial summaries and future projections. Advisors presented reports. Recommendations were discussed. Isabel answered questions confidently and guided much of the conversation. Everything seemed to be unfolding exactly as expected. Then Thomas closed one folder and opened another. The subtle movement immediately changed the atmosphere. "Before we proceed," he said calmly, "there are several historical trust matters that require clarification." A silence settled over the room. David looked surprised. Isabel's expression remained steady, but Ethan noticed her hands become perfectly still. Thomas distributed copies of several documents. Some were familiar, others were not. Dates spanning nearly a decade appeared across the pages. Property transfers, consulting agreements, trust amendments, layers of transactions connected through multiple entities. David frowned as he reviewed them. "I do not remember approving some of these structures," he said. Nobody answered immediately. Thomas adjusted his glasses. "That is because several approvals were executed through intermediary arrangements." Across the table, Eleanor slowly lowered her eyes. Ethan could feel tension building. Then the conference room door opened. Sophia Bennett stepped inside carrying a thin case file. Several people exchanged confused looks. Harrison remained completely calm. Sophia approached the table and placed additional documents beside Thomas. "These records were obtained through independent review," she said. "They established connections that were not previously disclosed." David turned pages one after another. The color slowly drained from his face. Names that had seemed unrelated now appeared linked. Dates aligned. Decisions matched. A pattern emerged. Ethan watched as realizations spread through the room. Years of carefully separated information were beginning to connect. Finally, David looked up. His eyes moved from the documents toward Isabel. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. The silence felt heavier than any argument. At the far end of the table, Harrison folded his hands and waited. After all these years, the moment he had anticipated was finally beginning. For several long seconds, nobody spoke. The only sound in the conference room was the faint ticking of an antique clock mounted on the far wall. David continued turning pages, each document revealing another connection, another decision, another carefully hidden layer that had influenced the direction of Harrison Estate for years. Across from him, Isabel remained remarkably composed. Yet the confidence that had defined her throughout the meeting no longer seemed quite as certain. Thomas Whitmore quietly slid one final folder across the table. Inside was a collection of records Harrison had preserved over nearly a decade. Meeting notes, correspondence, financial summaries. Dates matched, signatures matched, patterns matched. None of the documents alone told the complete story. Together, they revealed something impossible to dismiss. David leaned back in his chair and stared at the ceiling for a moment. The room felt smaller than before. "All this time," he said quietly, "I thought I was making the decisions." No one rushed to answer him. Eleanor finally lifted her eyes. There was sadness in her expression, but also relief. "That is why some truths become heavier every year they remain hidden," she said softly. Ethan looked toward Harrison. The old man had not celebrated. He had not smiled. He simply sat with the calm patience of someone watching a journey reach its destination. Sophia organized the final documents while James stood silently near the doorway. Years of questions now had answers. Years of uncertainty now had context. Isabel slowly folded her hands together. For the first time since Ethan had known her, she seemed unable to control the direction of the conversation. The future she had expected was no longer guaranteed. Harrison finally stood. Every eye in the room turned toward him. "This was never about revenge," he said. His voice was steady and quiet. "A family survives when people trust one another. The moment trust disappears, everything else eventually follows." The words settled over the room. No dramatic argument followed. No raised voices. Only silence and reflection. Outside, sunlight streamed across the estate grounds. Inside, the illusion that had guided so many decisions had finally been replaced by truth. Weeks later, Harrison Estate felt different. Not perfect, not healed overnight, but honest. David began rebuilding relationships that had been neglected. Ethan continued learning the responsibilities that came with the family legacy. Eleanor no longer carried certain burdens alone, and Harrison returned to his quiet routines, content to remain in the background. The notebook that had accompanied him for so many years was finally closed and placed on a shelf. Its purpose had been fulfilled. In the end, the greatest revelation was not who had been controlling events. It was the discovery that patience, truth, and careful observation had been stronger than influence all along.